Páni. Human heads, prominently nailed to trunks of trees. These were the words of the historian Tacitus. He was describing a battlefield. Páni. Not a story, but a report from a place where 3 entire Roman legions vanished in the autumn of 9 CE. Imagine you are a Roman soldier, part of an army that has conquered the known world. Páni. You march into the Teutoburg forest, a place your commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, believes is subdued. But the trees are too thick, the ground too soft, and the silence is too loud. Páni. Hemmed in by forests and ambuscades, your legions are exterminated, almost to a man. This is the part that gets left out of the history books. Páni. It wasn't just the Germanic tribes led by Arminius that defeated Rome. It was the forest itself. A place where Roman tactics were useless. A place that could swallow an army whole. Páni. Now, jump forward nearly 2,000 years. September Chirichichti, the Hurtgen Forest. It is the longest single battle the US Army has ever fought. Páni. For one soldier, Jacob Russer, it was simply hell on earth. Think about what that means. For 33 American soldiers, the fight wasn't just against an enemy they could see. Páni. It was against the forest. Dense woods and deep ravines neutralized their tanks. The endless canopy of trees grounded their air support. It became a fight of man against man, Páni, and man against mud, cold, and the constant, crushing fear of an enemy who used the woods as a weapon. Then Vietnam. Here, the forest became a living, breathing predator, Páni. The Viet Cong were masters of this domain, and they turned their home into a minefield. Booby traps accounted for 11% of all Allied deaths. Sharpened punji sticks hidden in the undergrowth, Páni. Tripwires connected to grenades, as Marine Paul Scalis recalled, the VC were very ingenious in that way. The fear was constant. Every step could be your last, Páni. The soldier Richard Dieterle wrote that his platoon knew the enemy would booby-trap old American positions because there was a real chance they would use them again, Páni. The enemy wasn't just in front of you. He was behind you. He was yesterday, he was tomorrow. But the terror went deeper than explosives and ambushes. Soldiers started whispering stories, Páni. Legends from the local Vietnamese people spoke of Ma, phantoms of the unburied dead, flitting between the trees, Páni. Some Americans even had their own tales of large, aggressive ape-like creatures they called rock apes that haunted the deep jungle. Generals can plan for enemy soldiers, Páni. They can strategize against ambushes. But how do you fight a war when your own men believe the trees have chosen a side and it isn't theirs, Páni? The question of how to fight a forest that has seemingly turned against you is not easily answered. Military doctrine offers no chapter on combating spectral forces or rock-throwing apes, Páni. But what happens when the enemy you can see uses these fears against you? Consider the Vietnam War, spanning from Hadounansart Sedem Tapie. Here, the Viet Cong VC did not just adapt to the jungle, Páni. They became an extension of it. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain, combined with a relentless ingenuity, transformed every patch of foliage into a potential trap, Páni. You walked with your senses screaming. Every shadow, every snap of a twig. Paul Scalis, AUS, Páni. Marine infantrymen noted that the VC were very ingenious in that way, with their booby traps. They understood the psychology of fear, Páni. Not just the pain of a wound, but the constant, gnawing anxiety that preceded it. The knowledge that the ground beneath your feet was not solid, that the forest itself held hidden dangers, Páni. Think about what that means. Every step you take could trigger a punji stake, sharpened bamboo coated in waste to guarantee infection, or a tripwire connected to a grenade, Páni. The enemy wasn't just unseen. He was embedded in the very earth you walked on. This psychological warfare was devastating, Páni. It forced soldiers into a state of hypervigilance, leading to exhaustion and trauma. And here's the part nobody talks about enough. The Viet Cong didn't just use physical traps, Páni. They exploited the local folklore. Stories of Ma, phantoms of the unburied dead, were woven into the fabric of jungle life, Páni. Some American soldiers reported seeing ghostly figures moving through the trees. Was it fatigue, fear, or something more? Dan Gannon, a lieutenant with the US, Páni. Marines in Vietnam described the chaos of a jungle firefight. It was extremely noisy, he recounted, and so I call it controlled chaos, Páni. You've got people running all over the place, you've got things happening. But even in this chaos, the unseen enemy, the jungle itself, remained a constant, terrifying factor. Páni. How do you control chaos when the environment is actively working against you? Steve Hoelane, a US Army soldier and Purple Heart recipient from Vietnam, understood this intimately. Páni. He knew there would be guys hiding out everywhere. They were crazy, unpredictable. This unpredictability wasn't just about the enemy's tactics. Páni. It was about the environment that allowed those tactics to flourish. The jungle provided infinite hiding places, infinite angles for attack. Páni. For him, the question quickly became, what in the hell are we doing here? This isn't just a modern phenomenon. Páni. 2 millennia earlier, in the Teutoburg forest, the Roman legions faced a similar terror. Páni. Publius Quinctilius Varus commanded 3 legions, but Arminius, the Germanic chieftain, used the dense woods to his advantage. The Romans, accustomed to open-field battles, were ambushed, trapped. Páni. Velleius Paterculus, a Roman officer, later wrote that the legions were exterminated almost to a man by the very enemy whom it had always slaughtered like cattle. The forest again was the Páni. Accomplice. It was the weapon, the silent killer. What truly happened in those ancient woods? Tacitus, the Roman historian, visited the site years later. He found hidden bones of men. Páni. Strewn everywhere or piled in heaps. He also noted human heads prominently nailed to trunks of trees, a grim warning, a psychological blow. Páni. But was this merely a display of brutality, or a deliberate attempt to instill a primal fear of the forest itself? Páni. Perhaps the Germanic tribes, much like the Viet Cong, understood that a terrified enemy is a defeated enemy. They knew the power of the unseen, the unnerving. Páni. They knew how to make the very air you breathed feel like a threat. So, what happens when the enemy doesn't just fight you, but makes you believe the very ground beneath you is alive with malice? Páni. What happens when the enemy doesn't just fight you, but makes you believe the very ground beneath you is alive with malice? Páni. The answer lies not just in the physical battlefield, but deep within the human mind. The psychological toll of jungle warfare was immense. Páni. The constant threat of ambushes and booby traps led to a state of hypervigilance. Sleep deprivation became the norm, and severe psychological trauma, an inescapable consequence. Páni. Think about what that means for a moment. You are constantly on edge. Every shadow, every sound, every rustle of leaves. Páni. What do you think happens to a soldier forced to live in that state day in and day out? His mind begins to play tricks on him. Consider Harold Roper, an early US Army tunnel rat in Vietnam. Páni. He described the fear of clearing Viet Cong tunnels. He felt, more fear that I've ever come close to feeling before or since. This wasn't just fear of the enemy, it was the crushing claustrophobia. Páni. The unknown lurking in the dark. And here's where it gets interesting. The Viet Cong used this. They were masters of psychological warfare. They understood that a terrified enemy is a defeated enemy. Páni. They didn't just lay physical traps, they laid mental ones. Paul Skalitz, AUS. Páni. Marine observed that when facing a traumatic experience, the body just does something different, just lies down and makes you keenly aware. This heightened awareness, however, could be Páni. Weaponized. But this isn't solely a modern strategy. 2 millennia ago, the Teutoburg forest demonstrated this same principle. Páni. The Roman historian Tacitus, years after the battle, found human heads prominently nailed to trunks of trees. This wasn't merely brutality. It was a message. Páni. A chilling display designed to terrorize. To make the Romans question the very ground they stood on. The Germanic tribes and Arminius knew their environment. Páni. They knew the dense forests of Germania were seen as mysterious and terrifying to the Romans. A place where their usual military tactics were ineffective. They amplified that fear. Páni. They made the forest an active participant in their victory. Now, let's contrast this with the documented accounts from the Vietnam War. Páni. While some American soldiers reported encounters with rock apes, large, aggressive ape-like creatures, these stories are considered folklore. Yet they spread. Why? Páni. Because fear creates its own monsters. Local superstitions in Vietnam also warned that the jungles were inhabited by phantoms called Ma, the spirits of those not properly buried. Páni. Some American soldiers reported seeing ghostly figures moving through the trees. Was it real? Or the mind, pushed to its breaking point, creating what it most feared? Páni. This isn't officially sanctioned intelligence. This isn't part of any military manual. But it works. The fear becomes self-sustaining. You begin to question your own senses. What is real, páni? What is imagined? In the Hrdgen forest, during the battle from September to December 1944, American forces suffered approximately 3,000 casualties. Over 9,000 were killed or missing, páni. Jakob Russer, a combat medic, remembered the struggle of recovering casualties, páni. He nodded. When we had a serious casualty who couldn't walk, then a litter team was sent up to recover them and bring them back. It was tough, páni. But you know you had a job to do. But imagine performing that job, knowing the enemy could be anywhere. Knowing the forest itself was against you, páni. You are fighting an enemy you can't see, in a place you don't understand, while your own mind turns against you. What happens when the enemy doesn't need to fire a shot to win, páni? What happens when the forest itself becomes the weapon, páni? When the forest itself becomes the weapon, the battle shifts from external conflict to internal torment. You are fighting not just soldiers, but shadows. The psychological toll is immense, páni. It forces you to question everything, your training, your senses, your very sanity, páni. Consider the plight of Jakob Russer, a combat medic with the 12th Infantry Regiment during the Battle of Hrdgen Forest from September to December 1944. He had a job to do, páni. But imagine trying to save lives when every rustle of leaves could mean another casualty. When the cold, damp air itself feels like a conspirator, páni. He later described it as hell on earth. How could anyone maintain their resolve in such a place? This isn't an academic exercise. This is a visceral experience, páni. Think about the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking your every move. It wears you down. It chips away at your spirit, páni. What do you think that does to a person over weeks, even months, in a place like Hrdgen Forest or the jungles of Vietnam? And here's the part that often goes unsaid, páni. The enemy didn't always need to fire a shot. The Viet Cong, for example, were masters of this psychological warfare, páni. They understood that the mind, pushed to its breaking point, could become its own worst enemy. They didn't just use booby traps. They used rumor. They used fear, páni. They made the forest feel alive with hostile intent. Take the stories of Ma, the phantoms of the unburied dead, in Vietnamese folklore, páni. Or the whispered tales of rock apes, aggressive, ape-like creatures that some American soldiers reported encountering. These weren't officially sanctioned intelligence, páni. They weren't in any military manual, but they spread. Why? Because fear creates its own monsters. And in the dark, dense jungle, those monsters become terrifyingly real. Paul Skellis, a U.S. páni. Marine infantryman, noted that a traumatic experience makes your body just does something different, like just lies down and makes you keenly aware. This heightened awareness, while a survival, páni, mechanism, could also be a trap. Every unfamiliar sound, it all screams danger. You become hyper-vigilant, exhausted, paralyzed by the sheer weight of possibility, páni. This isn't just about what you see. It's about what you don't see. The absence of information, the terrifying blank spaces that your mind fills with its deepest anxieties, páni. Imagine walking through a forest, knowing that a hidden tripwire could be just inches from your boot. Knowing that an unseen enemy could be watching from any of the millions of leaves around you, páni. What does that do to your trust in the world around you? Even 2 millennia ago, the Romans in the Teutoburg forest faced this, páni. Velleius Paterculus, a Roman officer, described how they were hemmed in by forests and marshes and ambuscades. Their structured legions, designed for open battlefields, were rendered helpless, páni. The Germanic tribes, led by Arminius, didn't just defeat them with weapons. They defeated them with the environment. They made the forest an active participant in their victory, páni. So, what happens when the very ground beneath your feet becomes a threat? When the trees themselves seem to conspire against you? You begin to lose trust, páni. Not just in your enemy, but in the environment, in your own judgment. The forest, once a place of refuge, becomes a labyrinth of fear, páni. And you are left alone, with your own mind to navigate its terrifying depths. What happens when the greatest enemy is the one inside your head, fueled by the whispers of the woods, páni? When the greatest enemy is the one inside your head, the war doesn't end when the shooting stops. You come home, But the forest comes with you, Ani. Its shadows stretch across your memory. Its whispers echo in the quiet moments. This is the part of the story that has no final chapter, Ani. It's a truth carried by soldiers from the Teutoburg forest in Devecee to the jungles of Vietnam, Ani. Field Marshal Slim Ons wrote, "To Ormen the jungle was a strange fearsome place.